All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Kraling, and I am the Retail Food Program Lead with the Iowa Department of Inspections and Appeals.
And I'm Kurt Rueber. I'm the Small Food Processing Lead with the Department of Inspections and Appeals, Food and Consumer Safety Bureau.
And today we are going to talk to you about the new Iowa Cottage food law, as well as the new home food processing license that is available to people. So first, a little bit about us and what we do. We are part of the Food and Consumer Safety Bureau with the Department of Inspections and Appeals. And our department has direct oversight of the food safety programs for 63 counties in the state of Iowa. So we do retail food inspections, which are restaurants, grocery stores, mobile foods, anything that is direct to the consumer. We also do home food processing establishment inspections, unattended food establishments, vending machines, hotels and motels, and then statewide, we do food processing and warehouse inspections and regulations. We contract out with 12 local public health agencies, which oversee 36 counties plus the city of Dubuque. And they do all of the same inspection types that we do, except for the food processing and warehouses. So in the state of Iowa, there are 67 total inspectors, including 7 that are specialized in food processing inspections. So this is a map of the state of Iowa, just to give a visual of the different contract agencies that we have out there. So you can kind of see where you're located at, and who is your regulatory authority for food inspections and food safety in your area. So the Department of Inspections and Appeals oversees everything that's in the white, and then the different colors each represent a different agency, a local agency. Yeah. So the new legislation that was passed July 1st of 2022, there were 3 major components to the new legislation. And the first one is the new law can be found in Iowa Code Chapter 137D, which all of these code chapters can be found on the Department of Inspections and Appeals website. So 137D changed the name of a home bakery to a home food processing establishment. In addition to changing the name, it put several new rules into place for home food processing establishments. In the past, a home bakery, people were allowed to make baked goods, whether they were refrigerated baked goods or non-refrigerated baked goods, and then they could sell them direct to the consumer, or they could sell them for resale to local coffee shops or grocery stores. The home food processing establishment license now it allows people to do a lot more, lots of different food types, which we'll get into. Iowa Code Chapter 137F is the new cottage food law. So it includes the information for food establishments and food processing plants as well, but there is a section in there now that is dedicated to cottage food. This law exempts cottage foods from regulations, but it does include some requirements for them. And then in addition to that, it also talks about packaged TCS food, which is foods that require temperature control for the safety of the food. So packaged TCS foods can also now be sold at a farmer's market without a license. As long as they are packaged and maintain proper temperatures, they don't need a farmer's license. The source of the food, though, still applies. And we'll talk about that in just a moment.
And Julie, I might just add here, for those who don't know, the Iowa Code is actually the law that was signed by the governor, and code editors put it in a nifty format. The Iowa Administrative Code are rules that are written by the department, but yet they are still approved by a legislative rules committee. So we don't just write rules without lawmakers having the final say about it. But when we reference Iowa code, that's actually the law, and Iowa administrative code are the rules to implement the law.
So the key to understanding the new laws, the cottage food laws, as well as the home food processing laws, is first to understand what a time temperature control for safety food is. So the laws are all based on what kinds of food can be sold and provided. So it's really important to have a good understanding of this concept first. So a time temperature control for safety food includes an animal food that is either raw or heat treated. So a cooked meat or a raw meat, a plant food that is heat treated, so a cooked vegetable, raw seed sprouts, cut melons, cut leafy greens, and cut tomatoes. It can also be a mixture of those things. The next one is garlic and oil mixtures that are not changed in any way, so they're unable to support bacterial growth. And then foods with a pH of less than 4.60 or a water activity below 0.085. So just think, is it an animal food that's raw or cooked? Is it a cooked plant food? Is it a raw seed sprout, a cut melon, a cut leafy green, a cut tomato, or garlic and oil mixture? And then cut leafy greens are also defined because it's not every kind of leafy green. It is a fresh leafy green whose leaves have been cut, shredded, sliced, chopped, or torn. And the term leafy green includes iceberg lettuce, romaine, leaf lettuce, butter lettuce, baby leaf lettuce, escarole, endive, spring mix, spinach, cabbage, kale, arugula, and chard. So leafy greens do not include herbs like cilantro or parsley. So, Kurt, do you want to elaborate on that anymore?
Well, I only to say that, this list of TCS foods does periodically get updated, and historically they don't fall off this list, but certain foods are periodically added. And that is a result of nationwide outbreaks that have been attributed to it. So it hasn't been that many years that cut tomatoes or cut melons have been considered a TCS food. But after a series of foodborne outbreaks throughout the nation, that's how they wind up. And scientists, everybody has a say in this. It's not just states making these determinations. It's open for public input, and they get a lot of academia input, and it's all based on science. That would be my follow-up point.
Okay. Oops, I lost something.
Julie, if you hit from current slide, that should jump you back in.
Did that work?
No, try.
There we go.
There it is. Thank you.
Okay, so jumping into cottage foods and the new cottage food law, which is Iowa Code 137F. So this that is on the screen is the definition in the Iowa law. And I'm not going to read the definition for you because I've got more slides that will cover everything, but there is an actual definition of what a cottage food is and what it does not include. So cottage foods are foods that are produced in a private residence. They are exempt from licensing and inspection. There's no limit on the amount of sales that one can do with cottage foods. They are foods that are sold direct to the consumer only. So no selling to a local coffee shop or a grocery store for them to resell. Foods that are allowed under the cottage food law are only foods that do not require temperature control for the safety. So non-TCS foods. So we just got done talking about what is a TCS food. So if it's a raw or a cooked animal food, it cannot be produced under cottage food law. If it's a heat treated or a cooked vegetable, it cannot be produced under cottage food law. If it's a cut melon, a cut tomato, a cut leafy green, it cannot be produced under cottage food law. Anything else can, so cookies, cake, bread, jams, jellies, as long as it does not require temperature control for the safety of the food. And then other processes that are allowed are foods that are controlled with a pH of less than 4.60 or a water activity of below 0.085. So if you are producing those types of foods that rely on acid to control it or rely on the water activity to control the safety of the food, each batch of food needs to be measured by a pH meter that's intended for food use or a water activity meter. And each container that is sold or offered for sale needs to have the date that the food was processed and packaged. And then batch records need to be kept by the producer and made available upon request, including at the point of sale. So if you have a roadside stand or you're at a farmer's market and you're selling pickles, for example, that would be controlled with a pH of below 4.60, you would need to have your records along with you when you're selling them at a farmer's market. And then there are labeling requirements as well for cottage foods, which we'll get into all of these. Okay. So common cottage foods are baked goods, candies, chocolates, other confections, dried fruit foods, including dehydrated or freeze-dried foods, condiments, dressings, syrups, your barbecue sauce, salad dressings, canned fruits and vegetables, as long as the pH and the water activity are controlled. So the canned fruits and vegetables are something that as they're being produced, typically it's something that will need to have an additional acidification product added to the batch as it's being produced. So it makes it have a pH of less than 4.60.
Are we going to address the juice down the line? Or? Okay.
Okay. So an example of cottage food labeling requirements. So this would be an example of what a label could look like. And the information that needs to be contained on it is the name and address of the producer and the phone number or an email address. So something to identify who produced that food. So this example has all three, but it doesn't need all three. It needs the name and address or the phone number or the email address. It needs to have the common name of the food. So chocolate chip cookies in this example. It needs to have the ingredients in the food, so in descending order of predominance by weight. And the ingredients also need to include the sub-ingredients. So in this example, we see that it has butter in it, but the ingredients in the butter would be milk, water, and salt. It has chocolate chips in it. The ingredients are the sugar, the chocolate, cocoa butter, etc. So they all need to be listed on the label. It also has to have the following statement: that this product was produced at a residential property that is exempt from state licensing and inspection. And then if the cottage food contains one or more major food allergens, it needs to have an additional statement that states that it contains whichever allergens. So this example contains wheat, eggs, milk, and soy. And then if the food is a home processed if it's canned pickles or vegetables or fruits, the date the food was processed and canned and packaged needs to be on that label as well. So, and these are some of the requirements, or they are the requirements for labeling. So there are a few things that are prohibited under the cottage food law. The types of foods that are prohibited are any food that requires temperature control for the safety of it. So those TCS foods that we talked about earlier, those are all prohibited under cottage food law. Any meat or poultry that's cooked or raw, and then production of milk or milk products. So if you're actually producing milk or a milk product, that's prohibited, as well as unpasteurized juice. Prohibited processes are sale or distribution of these types of foods for resale. So no selling to your local grocery store or coffee shop for them to resell. Cottage foods for sale. Cottage foods are not allowed for sale in a food establishment. So if you also own a restaurant or a grocery store or another outlet where you're licensed to sell food, the cottage foods cannot be sold from that location. The only exception to this would be in a temporary food stand. So if you're at a fair or a festival or a farmer's market, and the operator of that temporary food stand is also the producer of the cottage food, they could sell their cottage foods in their food stand. They could set up a little corner of the food stand and sell their cottage foods. The cottage foods cannot be used as an ingredient in anything that's being sold in that temporary food stand, but the cottage food itself could be sold from the stand. Other prohibited processes include low acid canned foods or any other canning process that does not result in a pH of 4.60 or lower, or a water activity of 0.85 or less. And then smoking for preservation and curing food is prohibited under cottage food law. Anything you want to add about this, Kurt? You want to add anything about cottage food before we get into home food processing?
That really covers it. Smoking can be done for flavor enhancement, but not for curing. I'm sorry, we're under the cottage law, so that would still apply, I guess. But
right. So that information that we just talked about is the new cottage food law. So shifting gears, we're going to talk about the home food processing establishments. So this is also was new as of last summer. And what a home food processing establishment is this is a licensed home kitchen within a private residence. So with a home food processing establishment license, a person can do up to $50,000 in annual gross sales of homemade food items. And we'll talk about what a homemade food item consists of in a minute. So these sales can be direct to the consumer. They can consist of those TCS foods as well as non-TCS foods, and they can be wholesaled to other outlets for resale. So you can pretty much do just about anything with a home food processing license, with the exception of a few things that we'll talk about. So some requirements with that is there needs to be some food safety training for the operator. Standardized recipes need to be used, which means that you're using the same recipe each time that you produce that homemade food item. So it's a recipe that's been tried and true, and it produces the same results every time. Food needs to be labeled when it leaves the home kitchen. And then there are other requirements that are specified in Iowa Administrative Code, Chapter 34. And we'll show you that in just a little bit. So definitions that are important to know when it comes to the home food processing establishment. And again, this is the licensed home kitchen. So home food processing establishment means a business on the premises of a residence in which homemade food items are produced for sale or resale for consumption off the premises. And then the business needs to have a gross annual sales of less than $50,000. So a homemade food item is a food that's produced and packaged in a home food processing establishment And it includes foods that are not TCS foods. But it does not include those foods if they're produced and sold under the cottage food law. So you can have a home food processing establishment where you have a license for your home kitchen to produce the food, but you can also partake in the cottage food law and produce your non-TCS foods and sell them outside of your home as well. As long as you keep your sales separate and keep your production records separate, because you don't want to overlap that cottage food and the homemade and the home food processing establishment. But you can do both out of your home kitchen. A home food processing establishment does not include the following. So these things cannot be sold with a home food processing license. So unpasteurized fruit or vegetable juice, raw seed sprouts, game animals or foods containing game animals, any food that contains fish or shellfish, no alcoholic beverages, no producing bottled water, no producing packaged ice, nothing with consumable hemp products, producing food with the intention to sell it to a food processing plant for them to use as an ingredient, or to sell it to another home food processing establishment for them to use as an ingredient in their products is prohibited with this license. Using a reduced oxygen packaging method, so no vacuum packaging. And then milk or milk products that are regulated under Iowa Code Chapters 192 and 194. So that's the production of milk and milk products. So again, you can't produce milk or milk products. And then meat and poultry items can be produced with a home food processing establishment, but they can only be sold to the end consumer. So anything that contains meat or poultry cannot be sold to another outlet for them to resell. That's a violation of Iowa meat and poultry regulations. So it's not allowed with the home food processing establishment license. And then raw agricultural commodities are like raw fruits and vegetables. Those are things that they don't require a license anyway. So we wouldn't license them with a home food processing establishment. You can grow your produce all day long and sell it wherever you sell it, and that is perfectly fine. So the next definition under a home food processing establishment that's important to know is the definition of produce. So produce means to prepare a food by cooking, baking, drying, cutting, mixing, fermenting, preserving, freezing, dehydrated, growing, raising, or another process. Produce does not include the following preparation methods. So low acid canning cannot be done with a home food processing license. Acidification, curing food, or smoking for preservation rather than flavor enhancement. Those 4 processes cannot be done with a home food processing license. But you can cook your food, you can cook your meats and vegetables, you can bake, you can dry things, you can freeze dry them, you can mix them, cut them, ferment, preserve, all of that. And then there are several more definitions pertaining to home food processing establishments, and those can all be found in Iowa Administrative Code Chapter 34, which again is on the Department of Inspections and Appeals website. So common homemade food items. So these are all foods that can be produced with a home food processing license and sold either direct to the end consumer. And most of them also can be sold for resale. So foods that are allowed to be sold direct to the end consumer or for resale are things like your cheesecakes, cream pies, or other refrigerated desserts, and cooked and cooled fruits and vegetables, and then all of your other baked goods. So foods that are allowed to be sold only direct to the end consumer with this license are raw meat and poultry that's raised by the permit holder and processed in a licensed facility, or cooked and cooled homemade food items that contain meat or poultry. So those are the only ones that you're limited to selling only direct to the end consumer. And then things that are allowed for resale are your non-TCS foods, like your cakes, cookies, breads, spice mixes, etc. Under a licensed home food processing establishment, you cannot produce canned fruits or vegetables or pickles, though. You can do that under cottage food, but you cannot do that with a home food processing license. So that's where it sometimes gets a little confusing for people, but as long as you make that clear distinction that I'm producing these foods under cottage food law, and I'm producing these foods with my licensed home food processing establishment, then you'll be okay. So prohibited processes or foods, and these are all listed in the definition of a homemade food item. So we talked about those, a minute ago. Prohibited foods include the unpasteurized fruits or vegetable juices. They cannot be produced with the home food processing license. Raw seed sprouts, foods containing game animals, foods containing fish or shellfish, alcoholic beverages, producing those or selling them, producing bottled water, producing packaged ice, consumable hemp products, producing milk or milk products, or foods that contain greater than 2% cooked or greater than 3% raw meat that is resold, that is sold to another outlet for them to resell to their customers. So all of those are prohibited under the home food processing license. And then prohibited processes again are the low acid canned foods, acidification, curing, smoking for preservation, reduced oxygen packaging or vacuum packaging, and then foods that will be further processed by a food processing plant or another home food processing establishment. And then the last thing that's prohibited, a prohibited process under the home food processing establishment, is made to order foods. So made to order foods are also defined in the definition in Iowa Administrative Code Chapter 34. And made to order foods are foods that are intended for immediate consumption. So it's like a restaurant carryout or delivery or a catered meal. So with the home food processing establishment license, one of the requirements is that all foods, all time or temperature controlled for safety foods, must leave the home kitchen at 41 degrees or below, packaged and labeled for sale. So hot foods, we can't make, tacos at home and have people call up and say, I want to order a dozen tacos, and you make them hot and fresh and sell them out of your home. You can make the taco meat and cool it and package it like what you would find in a grocery store, ready to take home and reheat. And that's perfectly acceptable with the license. But the hot, made to order, ready to eat food is not allowed. And then Iowa Administrative Code Chapter 34, again, these are the rules and the regulations for home food processing establishments. And they touch on all of these things. I mean, there's a section on licensing, physical facilities and equipment, management and personnel, receiving, storage and distribution, food preparation and protection, packaging and labeling requirements, sanitation, and maintenance of records by the licensee. So we're gonna go over just a couple of these different sections. And what we talk about in the slides that we show are not intended to replace the rules and regulations that are in Chapter 34. It's just it's a brief overview of these sections to give you a little taste of what this regulation is like and what this license includes. So the first section is licensing. So a license is required to operate a home food processing establishment. And any homemade food items that are prepared in this licensed kitchen are required to be on the license application. So if if an operator adds new homemade food items to their menu, they can go in and update their application at any time using our online system, or by submitting those new homemade food items through email or through sending a letter to our department. But the homemade, anything that they sell needs to be on their license application. In the management and personnel section, it talks about food safety training. So the person in charge is required to have some type of food safety training. And we have a list of different classes and courses that are approved on our website. And then the other important part of the management and personnel section is just that the operator the person who's making the food needs to have a thorough understanding of food safety principles. They need to be able to know what they're doing and know the safety precautions that they need to take for the foods that they are preparing in their home. They need to be able to demonstrate that they have control over all of those systems and all of the risks that are involved in the foods that they intend to make. So receiving, storage and distribution. So this is in chapter 34, it's point 5 of that chapter. Talks about how food and ingredients need to be obtained from an approved source. So anything that's purchased and used in production in a home food processing establishment needs to come from a licensed and an approved source. So a grocery store is a licensed and an approved source. A food distribution company is a licensed and an approved source. So other parts with this is, just having a clean area, clean storage area and clean production area. No raw or undercooked animal foods can be distributed in a ready-to-eat form under a home food processing establishment license. And then this is the section that talks about no made-to-order foods may be distributed, and then your time and temperature controlled for safety foods may not be distributed to a business or an end consumer at any temperature above 41 degrees. So that's where you can find the information for those requirements. So in 34.6, it's the food preparation and protection. So this section lays out the different requirements for cooking, cooling, holding temperatures, reheating temperatures, and then also talks about the specific preparation methods for different food types. So the high acid foods, there are specific requirements for those. Dried foods, including freeze-dried foods, there are specific preparation method requirements. Jams and jellies, preserves, fruit butters, non-standardized fruit and non-fruit jellies, standardized sweeteners and table syrups, and fermentation. Fermentation is one that it can be done. That process can be done under a home food processing establishment license. But then the person who is doing it needs to have a HACCP plan that's approved in advance prior to conducting any type of fermentation. And then this section also talks about the prohibited preparation methods that we talked about earlier, the low acid canned foods, acidification, curing, smoking for preservation. So 34.7 is the packaging and labeling requirements for home food processing establishments. So very similar to the cottage food requirements, but there are some differences. So again, this is an example of a label, and it needs to have a home food processing label, needs to have the name or the license number of the home food processing establishment if the name on the label is different than the name on the license. So minimum, it just has to have the name of the business. But if you're calling your business something else than what you originally licensed it as, then you have to have your license number as well. So a way to trace it back. The common name of the food, the ingredients, including sub-ingredients, again, in order of predominance by weight. The net quantity of the contents. So this example says 12 cookies. So that's the quantity by each. You could also have the quantity by weight. And then an expiration date, if it is a food that requires temperature control. So an expiration date of no more than 7 days is what is stated in the preparation methods section. Also the label needs to include the following statement: that this product was produced at a home food processing establishment. And then these labels also need to include an additional statement if there is a major allergen as an ingredient. And then the labels also, or any other marketing materials that are associated with the homemade food items, must be truthful and not misleading. So anything that could be considered an extension of the label, so you're advertising on Facebook, or if you have additional signs or placards in a temporary food stand, any claims that are made need to be truthful and not misleading. And then there are additional requirements as well, as far as making claims of nutritional value, or medical claims, or any other types of claims. And those are all found again in chapter 34.7 under the packaging and labeling requirements. Oops. And then the last section is 34.9, and this is the maintenance of records by the licensee. So in a home food processing establishment, it is required that records be kept. So the first record is having a standardized recipe. So using that recipe every time that you produce that food, so you are getting the same results every time. Production and batch records are required to be kept for each homemade food item that's produced. Records of ingredients that are purchased need to be kept. So keeping receipts, so you know where you purchase your ingredients from. And distribution records. So specifically, if you are wholesaling or selling to someone for them to resell, you want to keep those records of which batch that you sold to which facility. The reason for those types of records are all for recalls and tracebacks. If there is a contaminated ingredient that you purchase unknowingly and you prepare a food, recently there were outbreaks associated with peanut butter. So if you made, a peanut butter cheesecake and happened to purchase that peanut butter that was on a recall list, and you sold a peanut butter cheesecake to your local coffee shop, there could have been a chance that you unknowingly purchased contaminated peanut butter, put it in your cheesecake, sold it to the coffee shop, and then anyone who purchased that cheesecake, there is a risk for them to get ill. So if you have records knowing, that you can trace back and see, you could get that pulled off of the shelf at the coffee shop so they don't sell it to anyone and make anyone sick. So that's the purpose of having all those records and keeping them. Other records are annual water tests. So if you're operating off of a well, we want to ensure that your well water is safe. And then food temperatures, pH, or water activity records. And then any records of calibration for your pH meter or a water activity meter, if you happen to have one. You want to keep those records too, that you calibrated those. And then any records that you keep are required to be maintained for a minimum of 6 months. And then these records are things that as an inspector comes out to your home and does an inspection, they will ask to see those records and they'll review all of those records. And then they also need to be made available upon request if there's a complaint or an illness outbreak or anything else that we would need to see the records. So the last slide is just a side-by-side comparison then of the cottage food operations versus the home food processing establishments. And you can see kind of at a glance with the cottage food, there's not a license required. Home food processing, there is a license required. No food safety certification required for cottage food operations, but there is for home food processing. No limit on sales with cottage food, but $50,000 limit for home food processing. So just the side-by-side comparison. And then we also have on the Department of Inspections and Appeals website, there is a spreadsheet of several different foods. And it goes through it and it asks, is it a cottage food or is a home food processing license required for that food type? And just so you can kind of see what that looks like. Oops. It goes through the food items and has them all by the category, which was in blue. And then you can see by looking, if we go to one, we'll just go to roasted coffee beans. That's a good example. So can it be sold as a cottage food? Yes, it can. Can this item be sold with a home food processing license? Yes, it can. Do you need a license? Is a license required, or can this be sold directly to the end consumer? Yes, it can. And can it be sold on a wholesale or resale basis? Yes, it can. And then the last column will have any additional information for that specific food. So peanut butter, same thing. It can be produced under cottage food. It can be produced under a home food processing license. It can be sold directly to the end consumer, and it can be wholesaled because it's yes, 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 yes. So this is out there for everyone to see. Specifically, if you're interested in cottage food, these are common questions that we see all the time, and have all the time. And most of your answers can get answered just from going to our website and reading the information that's on our website. Kurt, do you have anything to add about?
I really
this
don't,
list?
Julie. That was very thorough and boy, it gave a great overview. And so I think we're kind of ready now for some questions to come through if anybody wants to kick that off.
Yeah, it has been an active chat for sure. And I have all of these questions that folks sent in beforehand. So I'll jump back and forth between the two. So just starting at the top here, if the lettuce has been cut from the plant, does that count as cut if you sell it as a bunch?
That is considered an act of harvesting. And if it's cut above the substrate, the growing media, whether that's earth or water in aquaponic operations, but that's simply harvesting the lettuce and it can be sold as a bunch. When you process the lettuce, that when you're cutting into the edible portion of the food, whether it's a temperature controlled food or not, that's when it goes from a raw agricultural commodity into the category of a processed food. I tell people if you stick a knife in an apple, it's a processed food. But to answer your question, harvesting at the substrate level. Now, I might add as a follow-up to that, because someone was apparently coached into doing this, is to go out and cut 2 inches at a time off the lettuce out in the field. And that's no different than if you cut it off at the ground, took it back and chopped it up. So that is no longer a raw agricultural commodity if that is your practice. You can cut it, let it grow back the next day and cut it again. That's a second harvest.
All right. We want to sell picked hickory nuts at the market. Are there any new or old rules pertaining to that?
Hickory nuts in the shell would be a raw agricultural commodity that there would be no licensing for.
Okay. Would cut leafy greens include sauerkraut?
It does include cabbage.
Okay.
Sauerkraut would be a fermented food. So cut leafy greens, shredded cabbage would be a temperature controlled food. And then the act of fermenting that into a sauerkraut would fall into whatever law accordingly.
All right. Where do I find the jam, jelly, juice, and preserves recipes that meet US law, USDA, and FDA regulations? There appears to be required ratios of fruit to sugar for specific berries.
That is very correct. And the law is under Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulation, Part 150. So Title 21 are FDA regulated foods. Code of Federal Regulation is often summarized with simply the acronym CFR. And then the part number pertains to jams, jellies, preserves, and fruit butters. Those are what's referred to as standardized recipes for authentically labeling them as a jam, jelly, preserve, or fruit butter. If you veer off of that standard, then technically, according to law, it is not a standardized jam and therefore should be called something else.
Some clarification from the chat on the hickory nut question. That was specifically for nuts that are cracked and the meat is picked out, not selling in the shell.
It would be a processed food, but it could be certainly made as an unlicensed cottage food directly to the consumer. If they wanted to wholesale that, it would have to be licensed as a home food processing establishment. And by the way, I'm not sure that it was mentioned, it's referenced throughout the law. We're talking about a $50 annual license for the home food processing establishment.
Here's a question from the chat. Just to clarify, if I make a sauce, I can sell the sauce in temporary food stands, but can't make anything and cook with it.
From a licensed facility, correct.
Okay.
And we're talking about a cottage food here. Now, sauces can be made under the home food processing establishment, which then could be used as an ingredient into another licensed facility. The difference is it's called something else. It's not an acidified food. It's a high acid, we often call it formulated acid food. That's when you start with already commercially processed high acid foods such as ketchup and mustard, and then you add some flavoring to that, recook it down and bottle it up. There's a process where that can be approved through the department, and in essence, it's based upon a maximum 10% low acid ingredients ratio into the high acid ratio ingredient total. So we take we get your recipe in great detail in the form of grams for each ingredient. We set certain things aside, such as preservatives and salt and sugar and those type of preservatives. We also set oil aside. And then what we're left with are high acid ingredients and low acid ingredients. And if the low acid ingredients are less than 10% of the high acid ingredients, and if it's further cooked for a pathogen kill step, and if the pH is monitored to ensure a maximum 4.60 pH, those products can be made in a home food processing establishment under license and could be wholesaled, and then could also be used as an ingredient in your mobile food truck or wherever else you might be vending.
Right.
But, and then to clarify that, if you're selling your barbecue sauce that's produced under cottage food law, and you're selling that in your temporary food stand, you're selling a bottle of it. And you could sell a bottle of your packaged barbecue sauce. That just couldn't be used as an ingredient then in your temporary food stand if it wasn't produced in a licensed facility.
If I make jam and baked goods in Iowa, Can I sell them in Nebraska? Which state rules would apply, or would it be federal rules?
Okay, so we, it kind of depends on whether it's wholesale or direct to consumer retail. Typically, you can make those products and ship them across state lines to the end consumer without any other criteria that needs to be met. If you're wholesaling into the other state, the state may have some state requirements that need to be met, and then you subject yourself to FDA regulation for wholesale transactions across state lines. And I think we even have a disclaimer somewhere in the rules themselves that says this does not negate the exploration of federal law. What is the exact terminology? I don't have it right in front of me, but the point is that wholesaling transactions could bring the FDA regulations into play.
Right. Are eggs considered a TCS food?
Yes.
Easy answer. Is unpopped popcorn considered a raw egg commodity?
Yes, it is a raw agricultural commodity.
Okay. Another question. As a proxy for water activity, can percent moisture be used as a metric for meeting food safety standards? I'm asking primarily with respect to dehydrated fruits and veggies.
Not that I'm aware of. Now, we're not scientists, but I can tell you there is a distinct difference between moisture content and water activity. Water activity is also referred to as active water. Active water is the water molecule that's available for microbial consumption. And there may be a correlation, but not a direct link to moisture versus water activity. Science tells us that the more you tie up the water molecules so that the bacteria cannot consume it, the safer it is. And the threshold for that is the 0.85 maximum water activity. Remember that bacteria are just like us. They have to have the proper temperature, a food source, and moisture to survive. If you can take one of those away, you can control the organism. And in the case of high sugar foods or high salt foods, you're taking away the water molecule from bacteria consumption. Hopefully that makes sense.
Here's a question. I've taken the food safety course from ISU Extension, but this did not cover food preparation. What courses are required and which are recommended to learn to safely prepare jams, jellies, preserves, and baked goods using berries and other fruits? And then when and where will these be offered?
I can take that.
Yeah,
one.
please.
So under cottage food law, there is no food safety courses required. However, it's great. I mean, it's a great practice to have some kind of food safety training. As far as on the Department of Inspections and Appeals website, we do have a list of approved courses for the home food processing establishment license. There is a course that is offered that was developed by Iowa State University, and it's an online course that's offered through them. That was written specifically for the home food processing license. So it covers the rules and regulations of a home food processing establishment and really gets into the safety, talks about the licensing part of it, but then also really gets into the food safety and the preparation processes as well. So we highly recommend that one just because we worked closely with them to develop that specifically for the home food processing.
Okay, thank you. Can I process my own poultry?
The answer is that's really a question for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. They have a meat and poultry bureau that probably should address all of those poultry questions. We're not experts on their law. I think that there is a small business exemption for a certain amount of homegrown poultry, but really we would point to the Meat and Poultry Bureau with the Department of Agriculture, Iowa Department of Agriculture for those details.
All right. Just to make sure, a spice mix can be made and sold directly to consumers as a cottage food, but only for resale under HFPE, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Can extracts be sold with the cottage food law?
The cottage food law, yes. Okay, maybe we should ask for a bit more clarification of the extract. If it's vanilla extract, typically they would put vanilla bean into a vodka or some alcohol base for an extended period of time, and then you have the flavored extract that's used as an ingredient in other foods. If there is another fanciful way of making an extract, such as simply squeezing fruits or something, we probably should have a bit more detail before we give you a concrete answer on that.
Can a farmer producing salad greens or fresh picked individual leaves wash and deliver in protective coolers and first use plastic bags, forego labeling to regular customers?
I might ask for a bit more clarification. You said the leaf of the lettuce there.
Yes, salad greens or fresh picked individual leaves.
Salad, if it's unprocessed, uncut, and you haven't altered the edible portion of the lettuce, it's a raw agricultural commodity that really has no regulation in Iowa.
Okay.
If there's more to that, please type it back for us. So if there's more clarification needed.
There's some follow-up on the extracts thing. It was extracts made with vanilla bean and alcohol. And then a follow-up question on all of that. So alcohol, when used as the chat's moving too quickly. So alcohol, when used as a menstruum for extracts and flavorings, would be allowed in cottage food and HFPE products. Is there an additional alcohol license needed for use in food products?
The answer is no. And if it's an ingredient, keep in mind the alcohol beverage division regulates alcohol beverages. But your vanilla extract would not be a beverage, it would be a conventional food that would fall under our jurisdiction, and the answer is clear that it could be made either as a cottage food or a home food item.
No different than doing a frosting for a cupcake that has a alcohol in it. That is okay to do as well, because it's not a beverage.
Are there any special requirements under cottage food rules when making gluten-free, dairy-free baked goods?
We do have, I believe we've exempted gluten from the special dietary use portion of chapter 34. So can you restate the question again, Amos? My mind got hung up on the gluten right away.
Sure. Are there any special requirements under cottage food rules when making gluten-free, dairy-free baked goods?
Under the cottage food, no. There are, if it's shelf stable and it's a cottage food sold directly to the household consumer and properly labeled, that would be fine.
So Kurt, on their label, can they call it gluten-free?
We might be borderlining on truth and labeling. I mean, if you're going to call some, Julia, that might be one that we have to kind of get clarified a little bit further. But under a home food processing establishment, if you make any kind of a claim like that, and foods that have special dietary use are not permitted as a home food item because you're getting too far into the weeds on medical claims or structure function claims and those kind of things. But I think gluten in itself was permitted, or gluten free, I should say. Can we look that up real quick? We'll circle back to that, Amos. If you bring that up, we'll try to get you an answer right here.
All right, sounds good. I'll keep going with some other questions while you're looking. So there's not a question in this specifically, but someone is curious about drying fruits and vegetables in the open air under passive solar. Are there regulations regarding that?
Really not. It's going to come down to the water activity content of the dried produce or product. And the law is silent when it comes to it could be oven dried, it could be sun dried, but we specified dehydrating and freeze drying as kind of a catch-all.
Okay.
Do we have an answer?
It doesn't call it out. Dietary use and
I thought we had gluten in there.
what's in the labeling section, so no.
Okay, I guess maybe we don't have any more to add about the gluten right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought we had an allowance where it's all under the definition of special dietary use. And so I think that we're going to conclude here by saying the answer to can it be gluten-free and labeled gluten-free should be fine. Are we?
As long as it's truthful.
If it's truthful.
All right. There's a clarification in the chat. To clarify on the gluten-free and dairy-free baked items, it would just be identifiable that those items are not in the ingredient list, but I could not identify them as gluten-free or dairy-free specifically.
Yeah, if they're not using dairy, or if they're not using gluten, that would be a truthful statement. You could say I'm not using salt either, or yeah. So if it's truthful and we would not object.
Okay. Changing gears here. So dehydrated or freeze-dried chopped vegetables would be allowed under cottage food, provided the water activity requirement is adhered to, but the product cannot be vacuum sealed.
Actually, it would probably behoove them to vacuum seal. Vacuum sealing really applies to temperature control foods that are ready to eat. So if you're properly freeze drying or dehydrating, you would want to vacuum seal or put in a hermetically sealed container to lock out the humidity in the air that the product is going to want to immediately begin to absorb again. Oftentimes they want you to, in the freeze dry world, they want you to actually put an oxygen absorber in with the packaged food to keep all the air out. For quality and preservation, for long periods of time.
So just to clarify that, with the freeze dried fruit foods are not considered TCS foods. So they can be vacuum packaged under cottage food or under a home food processing establishment license. If you would bake a chicken, you could not vacuum package it under a home food processing establishment license because it is a TCS food. And then that same chicken couldn't be made under cottage food law at all.
There's a question, since we're on freeze drying, are there any other laws specifically regarding freeze drying?
What other laws, not that I'm aware of, if someone has something very unique and specific, the one takeaway food for thought that I always try to include in freeze drying discussions is that a couple things. Science tells us that freezing does not kill pathogens. And so if it's in the food when you put it in the freeze dryer, it's still going to be in the food once you rehydrate it. That being point number one. Point number two is that during the sublimation of freeze drying, your ice forms on the interior of the vacuum chamber, which when it melts, leaves residue behind, which could include bacteria. And so we had the discussion, if you're freeze drying raw eggs, and then you freeze dry candy or something, that you've now just gone from a raw animal food into a ready to eat food. And the discharge line on the harvest right freeze dryers anyway, the discharge line that drains your frost water is also the inlet line to equalize your pressure when you're done freeze drying. So what just let contaminated frost water drain into your bucket now is sucking air backwards to equalize the pressure in the chamber. And so we talk about those kind of things because it could be so easily contaminating when you get a burst of air coming back in the freeze dryer and it aerosols whatever it's carrying in with it. That's being deposited on your freeze dried foods. And if it's ready to eat, you want to ensure that the interior of the chamber and the drain line and all those things are sanitary.
Question on spice mixes. How do you classify spice mixes? For instance, if I wanted to make a Stephanie special steak seasoning that has more than 2 spices or seasonings in it.
Just source your ingredients from an approved facility dried in accordance with law, and blend them together at will, and either wholesale them under a home food processing establishment or direct to consumer under a cottage food. Does that answer?
And appropriate labeling with the ingredients.
Mhm.
Question
I
on...
might, along those same lines, Amos, so Julie touched on it, but sometimes people don't realize what all it means. So you can't sell a home food item from your licensed home food processing establishment to another business that's going to further process that and put it out on their wholesale market. And included in that would be one home food establishment cannot wholesale to another home food establishment who does their thing with it and then wholesales it back out yet again. So if the spice ingredients are coming from your neighbor who is freeze drying these ingredients and they want to sell them to you and your home food establishment to blend them into a spice to wholesale, that's not allowed.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Could you talk a little bit more about water activity? If I'm making a dehydrated product, I'd need to use a water activity meter on every batch and make a record of the result, and obviously have it below the allowed amount before being able to sell that batch.
Okay, water activity meters are very expensive and we acknowledge that. And so in the case of dehydrating, it's not much of a concern of ours for freeze drying, because when you're done freeze drying, it is powder dry and it's pretty obvious. If you let the freeze dryer run its course, it's going to be sufficiently dry. Dehydrators are not that automatic because you oftentimes have to rotate shells and the airflow within them vary, and you might have really dry spots and spots that are not so dry, and the thickness of the product comes into play and all those things. And so what we have done, kind of teamed up with Iowa State University here on these water activity foods, and they would likely ask for the recipe of your dehydrating steps and procedures involved with that, what the commodity is that you're dehydrating. And then they would, and that would be your standardized recipe that Julie talked about. So you get repeatability every time. And then you submit that recipe along with a couple of samples. I think Iowa State wants one sample from one of 3 different batches. So you send them 3 samples from one from each batch, and they will do a water activity test for you. It costs you a few bucks, but now you've got the laboratory test result to go along with that standard recipe, and we can accept that for that product and that recipe going forward.
In a similar vein of testing, where do you learn about pH readings? For example, canned tomatoes to sell at a farmer's market using cottage laws. Do you test the pH of each jar at filling before closing the lids and processing?
No, the law does say each batch. And this is a good time to maybe talk a little bit about equilibrium. So tomatoes maybe isn't the best example. If I could change and talk about cucumbers instead, we're still acidifying, and it's still an acidified food. But my message would be, you have to establish the time it takes for the cucumber to equal a 4.6 or below pH. That doesn't happen immediately, and it could take many hours for that to happen. A whole cucumber is going to take longer than a cucumber slice, but we have to establish how long it takes for the cucumber to reach equilibrium with the acidulant that you put it with. Now, they don't have to be equal. That could take days, but it does have to reach 4.6 during that time frame, pH. And how that's done is you would initially, when you begin canning, you would take that product. If it's a whole pickle, you would sacrifice a jar, take the largest pickle out, and puree it. And so then you would check the brine with the pH meter, and you may have to add a little bit of distilled water to the pickle puree that you just ground up, but you would get an accurate pH reading of the pickle. If it hadn't reached 4.6 pH yet, you need more time. So you wait a few more hours, and then you check it with another pickle. Once that time has been established, now you're able to market it. It should be kept in-house until that time has been established, because that's when the public health control for acid control has been achieved. Now, the original question was, do I sample each jar? And the answer is no. In the case of pickles, once you've established the pH time, the equilibrium time, you still have to check each batch, but you can do it with a jar, one out of many, maybe a smaller jar that will represent the rest of the batch. When you do different sauces and those type things that are acidified, oftentimes they will ladle out a Dixie cup full or such amount to where they can cool it off a little bit before you check the pH. You want to check the pH at about room temperature. And so if it's being boiled on the stove and into a sauce, you want to ladle out a little bit and set it aside for a few minutes, or even put it in the fridge to let it cool down, because there would be no equilibrium time needed for that. It's all a fluid sauce. It's when you're trying to acidify the chunks of low acid vegetables is when you need to establish how long it takes to acidify.
My family's operation doesn't qualify under the cottage food law or HFPE license due to freezing, selling, or to a wholesaler, etc. I believe a food processing license is required. Will there be any upcoming seminars like today's for this type of licensure? I'll say PFI doesn't have any plans on the docket for that. Do either of you know of anything like this?
Well, I've been conducting quite a few farmer market workshops peppered throughout the state. And I'm willing to come anywhere anybody wants to have a decent turnout gathering, and I'm just an invitation away for doing just that. The wholesaling of meat products would still require that a warehouse license be obtained. The home food processing establishment license just does not allow for any wholesaling of any meat products. So you'd still need the warehouse license. And then you're limited to 50,000 with the home food processing establishment. So we see that there are still a fair number of people that still want to opt for the food processing warehouse license. Does that kind of make sense?
But as far as a training or a webinar on food processing, I don't know that we intend to do anything like that at this time. But we do have a kind of a sister website out there called the Iowa Food Protection Task Force website. A quick Google search for Iowa Food Protection Task Force will take you there. And once you're on that website, you can go to the resources tab, and there's a section for food processing facilities. And when you go to when you're on the food processing, there is a tab for basic requirements. And Kurt mentioned the Code of Federal Regulations earlier. And on that tab for basic requirements under the food processing, there are several links to different CFRs for different food processes. So that at least will get you a good start if you're interested in learning more about acidification or fermentation or any process for a food processing facility. And then reach out to our department with questions.
All right, thank you. If a loaf of bread is sold, does it require the label of ingredients and disclosure? And then a similar question on cookies from display cases put into like a wax paper bag for the consumer. Does that have to be labeled?
Okay, if it's a cottage food that's sold direct to consumer, it has to have a label. If it's a home food item that is on display in a self-serve type of a display, the label has to be either attached or affixed. And so the affixing the label onto the door, I suppose, of the self-serve cabinet would satisfy our requirements. The key takeaway is that the operators identified, the ingredients are all spelled out, and those are probably the two most important, and the fact that it's made in a home food processing establishment. And keep in mind, cottage foods cannot be wholesaled, so cottage foods go direct to consumer, packaged, either affixed or individually labeled with a different sentence that it's made from an unlicensed, unregulated home kitchen.
Another label question. If I'm selling things under cottage law and I have a brand name, does that need to be licensed as a business, or can I have my name and the brand name on the label?
That may be more of a legal question that we're not lawyers either.
Sure.
But as long as you're identified with your company name or your name or email address.
Right. As long as you're labeling the food according to cottage food labeling, which is outlined again in the Iowa Code 137F, and it's point 137F.20 is the cottage food law. And that has all of the labeling requirements for cottage food.
There's someone in the chat saying that the Iowa Food Protection Task Force website seems to not be working. Yeah,
it might be down for maintenance right now.
Okay.
I just give it some time and try again.
All right.
Because it periodically does that.
Good to know. I heard that sealing things in a bag makes the food processed. So can we vacuum seal dehydrated bananas under cottage law?
Yes, you would vacuum seal dehydrated bananas provided that the water activity is below 0.85. And it's, I've heard that same argument about closing the Ziploc bag. Now it's a processed food. I don't know the origin of that, but that is not the case. You can put green beans in a Ziploc bag and put a label on them and sell them at Fairway, for example, or yeah, the sealing of the bag does not in and of itself make it a processed food.
Right. Going back to the spice blends from earlier, are you allowed to dehydrate herbs you've grown yourself or only purchased from a grocery store?
No, you can grow them yourself. They came from somebody's field, you know, so why not it be yours? Once again, I would caution you to do your due diligence in washing, because once again, the dehydrating or freeze drying cannot ensure pathogen destruction. And as we know, you get the wild animals roaming through the field, and you got fecal material being dropped by a raccoon and salmonella from snakes and all these other things that you really have to address those hazards if you're selling your food as a ready to eat type of a product. Sorry.
So here's a question about does the individual person need to be licensed, or can they rent time in a commercial kitchen and prepare these products to fulfill the kitchen preparation requirements of state and federal laws?
Well, both of these allowances, cottage food and the home food processing establishment, the prerequisite for that is it has to be in your residence. And so if you're renting a space, you would be licensed differently, more along the lines of a retail food service establishment. And that comes with the whole FDA food code being applied to your operation for food safety.
All right. For folks still watching, we've got about 5 minutes left. So any last minute questions, toss them in the chat. Can I sell baked goods made with berries that are not included in the FDA regulations, e.g. blackcurrant, scones, muffins, cookies, that sort of thing?
Well, the answer is yes. It's a raw agricultural commodity that you're adding to your either cottage food or home food processing establishment. There is a point where when you incorporate fruits or vegetables into bread, for example, that once you bake the bread, you've now applied a thermal process to those fruits or vegetables. And there's a pretty high likelihood that the bread would then need to be refrigerated. And so if these berries and the name of the bread escapes me, where you put all kinds of meats and cheeses and tomatoes and everything else right in the dough, and then you bake it, that it would be a refrigerated food at that point, because you've applied a thermal process to the plant or animal food. Did anything to add on that, Julie?
No.
What about selling products with foraged berries?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I can't believe I didn't mention that sooner. So the only produce product that we regulate the foraging of would be wild harvested mushrooms. And then you're required to take some training for proper identification. So you can forage berries, you can cut asparagus out of the road ditch, you can do all those type of things, and it's still considered a raw agricultural commodity, with the one exception of mushrooms.
All right. Here's a question from the perspective of a grocery store. So as a grocery store, I can sell HPFE foods, but not cottage foods, correct?
That is correct.
All right.
We encourage you, if you are a business owner and want to offer foods from a home food processing establishment, that you ask them for a copy of their license and then have that on hand in your coffee shop or grocery store, just for documentation purposes. Because anything that you accept into your store, once you accept that and then you resell it, you're responsible for it as well. So you want to ensure that they're labeling things properly according to the regulations, and that you're only accepting food that is allowed to be prepared with that license too. And if there's ever any question, don't hesitate, just reach out to your inspector that you deal with in your grocery store.
Back to your example of kind of herbs and fruit in bread. Is dehydrated herbs and fruit in bread okay without refrigeration?
Well, once again, the water activity of bread is actually quite high. It's about a 0.93. And so if you dehydrate herbs or fruit and you put it in with the dough mix, which is baked, the herb or fruit is going to begin to rehydrate, because bread is actually a high water activity food. I can get into why it's not controlled under temperature, but I think if you're incorporating those foods into the dough of the bread, it would still require refrigeration, unless you work with a food science laboratory or someone and get a scientific review of their recipe and their procedures. The reason why bread in itself is not a temperature controlled food are one of a handful. One, there's never been a foodborne outbreak associated with it, attributed to it. Number two, there's typically a fermenting process that takes place when you're developing the dough. Number three, it's cooked at very high temperatures, but probably one that the scientists rely on the most is the fact that it's got a protective crust. And until you start cutting into it, then you have to worry about Staph aureus, which comes from humans, dirty hands or a soil knife or something. That's when you start to incorporate the potential risk, and then it's normally either molded or consumed before time enough develops for a problem to be identified. Did you want to add anything to that?
No.
Does that answer the question? So I think if you're incorporating anything into the dough other than typical bread ingredients, until we get some confirmation from a food science lab, we would call it a refrigerated bread.
All right. We're at 1:30, but there are just a couple more questions. So we'll finish out with these. Can you sell walnuts that have been toasted but are no longer hot at the market?
Yes. Either
Okay.
as a cottage food, direct to consumer, as long as it's packaged and properly labeled, and you could do it under a home food establishment license if you want to wholesale them.
And then final question, just wanting to make sure I have this correct. Canned items can be sold with cottage law if pH is below 4.6, which would include syrups and other canned items like pickles, salsa, etc.
Pickles and salsa, correct. Syrup, on the other hand, would not be a pH controlled food. That would be a water activity controlled food. And there's actually a standard of identity for syrups that essentially calls for a 65% soluble solids content, which is measured with a refractometer. Many of your members, I'm sure, know what a refractometer is. You put a couple of drips of the syrup on the prism and you hold it up to the light, and it'll tell you the soluble solids, anything that will dissolve in water. And when we're talking about these, we're talking about sugar content. And so if the sugar content, or the Brix, degree Brix is another reference to the soluble solids content, is at 65% or greater, it's a shelf-stable syrup. So there wouldn't necessarily be a need for a water activity test to be run on it, because it's in the standard of identity for syrups. But you're spot on when you say 4.60 maximum pH for whatever salsa you're doing, or these tomato products, any fruit or vegetable. I might point out that the law is specific to fruits and vegetables. So we get a lot of questions, can eggs hard-boiled eggs be pickled? And the answer is no, because the law specifies fruits or vegetables.
All
Did
right.
that answer the question?
Sounded like it to me. Thank you both very much. Julie, could you share your screen again so we can have the contact info for you two?
Yes,
Thank you.
sorry, I forgot that last slide on there.
Oh, and while you're doing that, quick one final question. Has the new rules affected honey processing or sales at all?
Oh, glad you asked. So raw honey is the one totally unregulated, aside from other raw agricultural commodities in their whole uncut state, but raw honey is an unregulated food in Iowa. So once again, if they want to flavor the honey, it's no longer pure honey. That can be done as an unlicensed cottage food. If they want to wholesale it, it does fall under the requirements for the home food processing establishment license being needed. Now, honey is safe on two levels. It not only has a water activity far below the 0.85 public health control, but it is also pretty acidic. A lot of people don't realize the pH of honey is about 4. So you would not have to test each batch necessarily unless you're doing something very unique, but where frankly the honey almost would have to become equal or minor ingredient into anything that's going to affect it too much. I would think maybe I'm sticking my neck out a little bit because I don't underestimate the innovation that's being had out there. But if again, to wholesale it, if it's not pure honey, it would need a home food processing establishment. If it is a cottage food, and if it's shelf stable without question, there would be no licensing needed for flavoring the honey. And creamed honey, if you're creaming the honey with other pure honey that has just been crystallized, that is still pure honey.
All
In the
right.
sense of the law.
Thank you very much, Kurt and Julie. There's a lot of gratitude in the chat. So this has been a really deeply informative and interesting Farminar. So thank you both very much.
We certainly appreciate your invitation. Anytime we can do things like this to make it more clear or clear the air or clarify things, we're all for it. And so we encourage you to call if you have further follow-up questions, and we thank you for the invitation.
All right. Thank you to everyone in the audience for all your questions, and have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.